So first, quick definition of intersectionality. African American women in the United States and worldwide, but particularly in the States, receive persistent discrimination, and over the past 100 years of our history. And that's sort of because of the dual burden that they share of gender and race. They're discriminated against because they're African American, they're discriminated against because they are women. Crenshaw, in 89 and 91, describes intersectionality as a method of explaining social oppression. And Sarah in 2006 says that our legislative bodies would be better if we had a better understanding of intersectionality and how it affects our government process. So this project had two goals, somewhat ambitious goals. The first was to ask if the dearth of African American women on Boston City Council is unique. And if so, why does this occur? So my hypothesis is Boston is unique. From that I say African American women are currently underrepresented in Boston, and so are women when compared nationwide. My other is that men and men of color are not underrepresented in Boston's municipal body. So one of my primary case studies was the 2009 municipal election. That was the first instance of a successful African American woman being elected to Boston City Council. So some of the factors that I looked at dealing with this, I suggested that the other candidates that the woman runs against matters, whether they're incumbents or men in particular. That turnout could definitely play a role if a specific block of the city was more likely to vote during that election than other ones. Next was perceptions of office prestige. I looked at the differences between the State House and the City Council because both houses here right in Boston. Boston has 22 delegates to the State House, and there are 14 seats on the City Council. And then my last hypothesis was gender plays a greater role than race and ethnicity, so I'm trying to divide the notion of intersectionality to see which one plays a greater role. So descriptive representation, Mansbridge says representatives that defines it as representatives that basically look like the population they represent. It doesn't have to be looks, it can be sexual orientation, it can be occupation, age, anything like that. The notion is that the best representatives are the ones that look like me. And we see that sentiment throughout American history, from the Constitution saying that only the President of the United States needs to be an American-born citizen. We see that alive today. Yesterday, President Obama had to release his birth certificate, the long format, because the other one wasn't good enough. It also carries over into the notion of carpetbaggers, representatives that move from district to district trying to gain election. So, just a quick review of the literature and some of the variables that play into this. The first is the pipeline. It's basically that pool of eligible candidates within an electoral district that can run for that, specifically women, but in this case we're using it for African American women. The electoral structure, there's three types of municipal structures. There's a mixed system, an at-large system, and a district system. District divides the city up into different compartments. Boston has 9 districts. The at-large is the individual councilors are elected citywide, and a mixed system combines the two. There's a lot of research on which type of structure is the best. At-large systems are more likely to have women on them, whereas district systems are more likely to have African Americans. So this is where the trouble of intersectionality comes into play. Desirability and prestige is kind of an ambiguous term. I go on later to try to operationalize that. But Diamond in 1977 states that women hold seats where they're less desirable, less prestigious, the salary is lower, and the legislative load is less. And then also population demographics. My case study involved the entire city of Boston, so we looked at differences between the Caucasian community, the African American community in particular. So to do this, I set up a simple ratio. using 30 cities across the United States, 30 of the largest cities, with Boston obviously as the targeted case study. From the websites of each of these cities, I gathered the number of seats on the council, the ethnicity of each member, the gender of each member, salaries, term limits, and the type of system that they used. Cities are obviously different in size and makeup and everything like that, so there needs to be a way that we can compare them across the United States. So we use this ratio, which basically depicts where a parity level, so a 1-to-1 ratio basically of African American women in the city to African American women on the council. So a perfect level would be 1-to-1. So we rework this equation, and right here is the equation for Boston. So there's one African American female, we divide by the number of council seats, and then that over the number of black women in the city and the total population. So if 1 was a perfect parity level, Boston needs a 0.56, which seems pretty terrible, but we don't know that for sure unless we look at the other cities. So here are the other cities. The highlighted bar across is the parity level. Boston is the red right there. And we see that some cities are way above parity, some are drastically below the parity. Now, when I did a significance test to see if Boston was different, I found out that they weren't in this case. But you see all of these cities right here, here. They're cities that don't have African American women elected. So I had to figure out a way to get around this, because some of those cities don't have a large enough population of African American women to constitute a truly descriptive representative seat on the council. So we once again reworked the equation to get an expected level of African American women on the council. So once again for Boston, given the population of the city, we would expect 1.78 African American women on the council. Obviously you can't have partial people, but it stands as a representation of the population at large. So we can once again compare all of the cities, Boston being right here. You can see that cities like Chicago have extremely high rates of representation compared to, say, Sacramento, Oklahoma City. So to figure out the significance of this, I did a simple z-test, which the results are right here. So Boston, as far as African Americans, our significance level is right there. It shows that the level of representation of African Americans in the city of Boston, while this level is just under 1, so it's almost at parity, it's actually significantly less than the other cities that have African Americans on their councils. Same holds true for African American women. That is their parity level, as we discussed, and the significance amongst the 19 cities that have African American women on their councils. And then finally, African American men. We see that in Boston they are above parity level, but we also see that African American men are underrepresented compared to other cities as well. So, as I stated before, Boston has a mixed electoral system. 17 of the cities that I looked at exhibited this. And so I wanted to see if this played any sort of role in the election of African American women. So, women as a whole, we see the significance for Boston. It's the underrepresentation of women is pretty prominent. Looking at the significance level right there. African Americans as an entire ethnicity doesn't really matter in this case, whereas we look towards African American women, it is significant. So given this, we need to figure out why. From this, it looks like women are underrepresented more so than African American ethnicity. So we need to look at Boston specifically. Boston has had deep liberal ties in abolitionist past. They've been home to notable people such as Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. Yet a recent survey came out saying that Massachusetts and Boston itself is one of the least desirable places for African Americans to visit. So they do have somewhat of a troubled racial legacy extending back from the busing issues of the 1970s to earlier this month when violence in Dorchester brought one of the MBTA buses on Route 15 to crash into a building. But the thing is that Boston had the first charter branch of the NAACP. They're celebrating their 100th anniversary this year, so they're established in 1911. And we look at the population of the executive boards within the NAACP, and there's a president's council, and of that, there's a male president and a male treasurer, but the 3 vice presidents and secretary are females. So you look at that and you think there's definitely some room there in the pipeline. There's eligible candidates, people that are involved. You take a step further down and look at the executive committees. There's 20 of them in the NAACP's Boston branch. 10 of the officers within that are female. 4 are male and 6 are vacant seats. So I would argue that it's not a pipeline issue. There's plenty of women, African American women in the city that are eligible to run and willing to run. A couple of notable office holders. Current governor right now, Deval Patrick. He is the first African American to be re-elected governor in the United States. Massachusetts is home to Edward Brooke III, who was the first African American senator in the modern era. So if we compare across state capitals as well, Boston ranks 43rd in terms of representation for women out of the 50 state capitals in Washington, D.C. However, if you look at the state legislature, they rank 20th. That shows some sort of discrepancy between the Commonwealth as a whole and the city. Additionally, women in New England are more likely to be successful on their campaigns for state legislatures compared to other regions. They rank 2nd besides the western states. However, when it comes to municipal elections, New England is last. Surprisingly, the South, which is the least hospitable region for women in state politics, is the best for municipal politics. So there's a couple of theories about barriers for women in Boston specifically. First, the limited pool of potential candidates, which I don't really buy into. Low levels of political ambition, which sort of matches with this, which I do not buy into as well. Propensity of women of color and women in general to run for the state house instead of the city council, which I explain in a little bit. Incumbency issues, which have definitely been a problem. Resource problems. I did not measure that in this study, but that can definitely be considered. And then Boston uses a nonpartisan system for their elections, so you can't really look into level of party support, which is another barrier. And then finally, potential that long-standing mayor Thomas Menino acts as a sort of barrier, a gatekeeper to offices within the city council, given that it is a strong mayor, weak council system. So just as an anecdote, the 2004 Boston delegation to the State House, 4 of the women within the delegation were women of color out of the 6 women total. And more African American women from Boston have served in the State House than on City Council. And this mirrors a trend for women in general. So we look at this since the passing of the 19th Amendment. Women have consistently run for the state legislature in Boston when compared to the City Council. So we need to figure out why this is. So first, I looked at the prestige of office. The desirability hypothesis states that the higher the level of office, the less likely that women will be in it. But how do we operationalize prestige? Welch in 1994 used salary in her study. So looking at the salaries of the 2 types of city councilors, at-large and district, compared to state representatives and state senators, you see some sort of a discrepancy there, where the city councilors are paid a lot more. If we were to look across all of the cities, I did what's called salary per capita to see what the salary is per citizen within that city, and found that the cities that have higher levels of African American women on their councils have the lowest salaries. Now, one thing that's not really addressed within literature is prestige. And I don't completely agree with Welch's definition of salary as a measure of prestige of office, because I think people in politics have power. And you look at the state legislature, they have a lot more power than Boston City Council. City councilors are not allowed to pass legislation. They want to change the speed limit out on the Fenway. They have to sign a home rule petition that has to be approved by the mayor, the state legislature, and the government. They don't have any real legislative power. So that kind of defies this, in my opinion, desirability theory, because all city councilors can really do is advocate. They get paid a lot to do it, but the actual outcome of it is minimal compared to the state legislature. So, City of Boston is divided into 22 wards and 254 precincts. Also, they have 9 district seats. We are right here, which is District 8, Ward 4, Precinct 10. That's where we are right now, just to give you a frame of mind. And the 2009 election, 2 at-large councilors, Sam Yoon and Michael Flaherty, ran for mayor, so there were 2 vacant spots on the at-large block of the city council. The African-American woman that was elected, Ayanna Presley, she was the only female within the field of 15 candidates, and one of only 2 African-Americans. She's from Upham's Corner in Dorchester. The African-American was now current city councilor Tito Jackson of Grove Hall in Roxbury. So I wanted to look at how supportive the African-American community in Boston is of women and of men. So this is for Ayanna Presley, so the female candidate. We have some statistics on the side here. The R is the correlation coefficient. R squared is the coefficient of determination, and that shows the proportion of total variance. So it seems to be a pretty strong indicator that as the African American population increases, so does the vote percentage. But we want to look at the regression line as well. If you tabulate that out, it proves that, yes, 2.2, for every 2.29% increase of the African American population, you have a 1% marginal increase in the vote for Ayanna Presley in 2009. But we need to compare that to Tito Jackson's things that I can discuss. Presley definitely benefited from her ability to run at large, in my opinion. She would have run for a district spot. She most likely would have been head-to-head against a male. Specifically within the minority districts, there's almost always an African-American male running in those, and almost always an incumbent running in those elections. So the other candidates do matter. Presley had a strong political background. She was an advisor for Senator John Kerry, and I think that that gave her some sort of push within the municipal body, some kind of sway with the Mayor Menino. But I can't really measure that, and can only leave that to speculation. And then turnout, as we just discussed, was somewhat irrelevant. So overall, dividing intersectionality, women in general face more difficulty running for the city council in Boston than the state legislature. And while Boston has a strong African American community, it seems to become fragmented when an African American male and woman run against each other. And that's somewhat of a historical trend. We also saw that women in Boston are more likely to run for the state house, which, depending on how you define prestige of office, that defies the quote-unquote desirability of the office. Now, I wouldn't suggest changing necessarily the institutions that Boston has, because if you get rid of the at-large election structure, you make it more difficult for women. you get rid of the district structure, make it more difficult for African Americans. So you can't really do that. So what you need to look into is the culture, which I think you define within the individual precincts of Boston. It's the culture within the African American community and the city at large that has sort of created this gender divide within the African American ethnicity. Also, I still don't think it is a pipeline issue. There are countless African American women that are interested in politics that I've discussed politics with, that are involved in activities. There's countless books on the women of Roxbury and their role in politics within the city. So, and then I just want to conclude by saying, where now? I think future study could look into better defining prestige, desirability of offices, how candidates decide to run for a certain office when they have multiple offices to choose from. So for the case of Ayanna Pressley, she could have run for state legislature or city council, but she chose city council, the one that has historically been more difficult. So I think that would be kind of interesting to look into. And one thing that I would probably go next with this within my graduate studies would be some sort of external validity, testing the same sort of test, but in other cities, to see if African American women are less likely in other communities to be elected amongst their peers, amongst their ethnicity, because I think that would show a larger trend nationwide than just what we see in Boston.